Great, you can hear me. We'll be starting in just a couple of minutes. Okay, so if you could take your seats, we'll begin the first plenary session of ARC 2018. Thank you very much. Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. Welcome to the 2018 Asian Racing Conference, the 37th edition of the event. My name is Adnan Nawaz. It's going to be my pleasure over the next 3 days to be your MC. I'd like to, first of all, personally thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of such a wonderful event. Those I've been dealing with both at the KRA and the Hong Kong Jockey Club. To you, thanks very much indeed for all your attention in helping me prepare for this. Just briefly, I've been a broadcast journalist for more than 25 years, the vast bulk of which was spent with the BBC. I've worked in newsrooms and I've worked in sports rooms and radio and in television. If you go back to the start of the 1990s, those two departments, news and sport, were very distinct from each other. They were very much separate. But then something specifically in the UK happened. In 1992, football's English Premier League was formed, and it became quite obvious very quickly that this was more than just about sport. Of course, the financial impact was huge, but there were also all those new exotic foreign players that were coming in. The TV coverage was so much more flashy. There were so many more cameras, and it was entertainment, and it was big business. And that really had an impact on all sport, probably all over the world. And then in 1995, the BBC launched a new radio station. It was BBC Radio 5, and it was for news and sport, primarily for live coverage of the two. The distinction now between news and sport is so much blurred than it was before, because of course we all understand that sport is so much more than the action and the human emotion that action elicits. It's entertainment, it's business, it's news, it's finance, and it's also a cultural phenomenon, of course, because sport, wherever it's played, wherever the action is, has a huge cultural impact regionally, nationally, and internationally. And all of these things that I've mentioned, racing has all of those, of course. And over the next 3 days, we'll talk about some of the issues I've mentioned, but we'll talk about so much more. And to give you a welcome speech, that's it from me for the moment. Please welcome to the stage the chairman of the Asian Racing Federation, Mr. Winfried Engelbrecht-Bresges. Winfried.
Good morning and welcome to the first plenary session of the 37th Asian Racing Conference. I would like to take a few moments to set the stage for the next 3 days. Over the course of 12 plenary sessions of the ARC, we will hear from nearly 50 accomplished speakers, industry leaders, true experts in their fields. We will delve into a wide range of topics that I believe will reach all stakeholders joining us in Seoul. The modern consumer finds themselves in the midst of experience economy. Without question, more than ever, consumers demand multisensory experiences, ones which are much more creative and engaging. Technology and innovation play massive roles in these experiences. It's often a brand which provides these experiences, a brand which reacts to an ever-changing landscape to make available those experiences to the consumers. A brand that creates a connection. The questions relative to racing and a racing brand are obvious. What is the global brand of racing? What takes it to build this brand? How can we collectively ensure that the brand is received positively across what is an extremely competitive marketplace for the attention of our current and prospective customers? This experience economy, essentially a combination of leisure and entertainment, is gemmed with seemingly endless supply of options. offer 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days in the year. Urban infrastructure is no longer required to provide such full sensory experiences for any brand. The concept of needing to be in a city that never sleeps, be it New York, Hong Kong, Tokyo, or certainly right here in Seoul, has transformed into a world where anyone with a mobile device can be engaged at any time with any brand. How does our sport or industry fit into this? At this opening session, we want to develop what we call a vision for a global brand of racing, but it will be framed by the keynote remarks from Bernard Salt, a leading demographer who will explore the modern leisure and entertainment market in light of demands of the 2018 customer and beyond. I'm certain you will be interested and engaged with Bernard, what he has to offer. Later in the session, Phil Lynch, CEO of media for Manchester United, will examine how one of the world's most successful sporting clubs and one of the most universally recognized brands communicates with its customer. We are proud in the Hong Kong Jockey Club to be a partner with Manchester United in our community sports activities, and we learn a lot in a way in this connectivity from how they present their brand. Our dialogue today will evolve from this foundation. Later today, we will address how racing is currently and how it should be both reach its current and future fan base through the evolution of technology, particularly engaging via television, mobile video devices, and in light of one of the fastest growing enterprises, esports. What is racing's plans for diversity and inclusion? Are we engaging as many consumers as possible? Sports science and the development of the modern elite jockey will be explored later today. How are these athletes, the human participants in the sport, prepped to handle the physical demands of racing? Tomorrow, we will begin a look at the strategies and opportunities facing the global leaders in wagering, which is the lifeblood of our sport. Sports and racing integrity will come into the focus thereafter, as leading international experts will identify the current issues of integrity and the regulatory response. We will explore the softer side as well, how racing engages with and through popular culture. Of a more scientific nature, we will also get an update on the critical threat of gene doping, the advances in the industry, as well as the latest research among equine veterinarians. On Thursday, the welfare of the horse steps to force with the International Forum for Aftercare of Racehorses and the Men of War project. Strategies in equine welfare will be pursued, including focus on traceability and how early actions can positively benefit long-term outcomes. The RF Anti-Illegal Betting Task Force was established at the 36th ARC, and we will get an update on their work, developments in the ongoing fight, and some useful perspective on countermeasures to illegal gambling. Developments from a new ARF affiliate members and positive growth from existing members will be revealed in the industry profile session. We added one new element because, in a way, especially there is in the news that there are developments in relation to the Hainan province in China. Many of you will see in the press reports and the announcement of the State Council policy document on deepening reform with the Hainan province. Interesting references were made in that policy document to the development of flat racing. It is possible, and especially in relation to guessing games, it is possibly too early in a way to and too premature to venture to interpretation what this signifies. But nevertheless, we feel it's important to state at this conference what is in the public domain. I will make a presentation, a short presentation during the industry profile session on this topic. The industry profile session will then be followed by an assessment of the recent development on racetrack and design and safety. For me, and I'm biased, the program of the 37th Asian Racing Conference is one of the best we have ever arranged. I'm most hopeful that you will both enjoy and be energized by the next 3 days, and I'm certain our industry will be better prepared for working together for this significant challenge we face in the future. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much indeed. Today's keynote speaker, the presentation is going to be delivered by a man who last year was recognized in his country's honors list and awarded the Member of the Order of Australia. He is a world-leading expert on social, consumer, generational and demographic trends. He's the author of 6 books, unless you've published any since I did my research. One of those, published in 2014, was entitled More Decent Obsessions, and I thought that's probably a good way to describe how people in this room feel about racing, a decent obsession. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bernard Salt.
Of the demographics group. We've got the microphone working. That's fine. That's fine. You can hear me?
No.
You can now? No? We'll get a technology person up here.
Yeah. Can someone come up and help Bernard with his microphone? Okay, at the moment it's off. So if my TV training is any good, if that's the on button, which it isn't. Ah, there we go.
How's
okay.
that? Is that better?
No.
Great,
Perfect.
great, thank you. Thank you very much, Ardan, for the introduction, and thank you to the ARC for the invitation to speak. Bernard Salt, I am the Managing Director of the Demographics Group. We are a specialist consultancy providing advice to business and government on demographic, social, cultural and generational trends. My presentation today deals with racing through the Asian century, the rise of Asia. I have a very simple proposition, and that proposition is that Asia and Asian nations are the fastest growing wealth generating region on the planet in our time in history. That will generate more consumer spending. That will generate a demand for growing leisure and entertainment activities. That is an opportunity for the horse racing industry. Not just now, but right through the 2020s. A very simple proposition. I want to start by taking you through some of the global megatrends that I think are underpinning this part of the world and leisure and entertainment and horse racing in particular. I want to start by looking at the 15 biggest countries on Earth in terms of economic activity. Starting, of course, with the United States of America. $20,000 billion per year. Think of it as turnover. Think of it as retail sales. $20,000 billion in GDP every 12 months. There's China at about 14,000. China is now at about 60% of the American economy. In the year 2000, it was at 33%. In 1990, it was at 10%. The projection is that by the middle of the 2020s, in US dollars, not in purchase price parity, but in US dollars, China will be the largest economic force on the planet and in history. That changes the dynamics of Asia more generally. Then, of course, Japan, Germany, UK, France, India, of course, number 7, South Korea at number 12, Australia at 14, and Mexico at 15. My issue here is, if you just go back 10 years and see what the ranking was at that time, the United States, well clear of the second largest economic force on the planet, Japan. China then, barely 1/3 of the US. You can see clearly the trajectory. This is not just China, this is Asia more generally. This part of the world is changing. The spending patterns are changing. You cannot drive from the airport into Seoul and not see that this part of the world is changing dramatically. There is an opportunity, and the opportunity is there for luxury goods retailers. As you can see, they have been very agile in responding to that. The next iteration is leisure and entertainment, in fact. I wonder what this looks like in 10 years' time. The OECD has done projections. Here are the 15 biggest economies on the planet, as estimated, in 2028. There's the US, and just ahead of China at that time, whereas there are 6 Asian-based nations in the top 15 today, and 10 years ago, by 2028, there will be 6, in fact. And you can see the rise of India, the rise of China, the rise of Japan, the rise of South Korea, even the rise of Australia, largely due to immigration and the emergence of Indonesia. Here is the greatest wealth generation region on the planet in our time in history. That creates an extraordinary opportunity. This industry needs to grab this with both hands, in fact. There is a grander theory behind this, in fact. It was introduced by a psychologist called Walt Rostow, an American, who in 1960 identified the stages by which countries go through from subsistence to mass consumer society. From subsistence, and that might be an example of Bangladesh, for example, then there is a transition. I would argue that Vietnam is very much in a transition at the moment. Then takeoff. I think China is actually past that stage, in fact. Then to a drive to maturity, and then to an era and age of mass consumption. You can see this transition as a country becomes wealthier. There is investment in infrastructure. There is the creation of what we call leisure and a demand for entertainment. And of course, goods that deliver and experiences that deliver self-esteem. This idea was actually put forward in 1943 by a psychologist who talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, from the physiological, where you actually need food, water, shelter, security, the basic needs to live a human life. Interestingly, this idea was formulated in the middle of the Second World War, 1943. And as wealth and prosperity increases, then there is a demand for other types of goods and services, and reaching a demand for self-esteem. You buy products and experiences to deliver self-esteem. And that is the stage that Asia is at the moment. And you can actually see this, I think, in quite an important document that came out about 2 months ago. It's produced by the global management consulting firm Bain & Co., and it tracks luxury goods spending across the planet. I just want to pull out 1 or 2 figures from this. Luxury goods spending growth over the 2016-17 financial year increased by 15 percentage points in China. Here is a country that is going through transition. Here is a consumer market that wants goods and experiences and leisure, I would say, to deliver self-esteem. Japan is a mature market, and of course the US only increasing by 2 percentage points off a very high base, of course. But the opportunity here in luxury goods retailing is in China. And in fact, if you look at the categories, I thought this was relevant too. If you look at the categories of luxury goods spending, 6 percentage growth in luxury car spending over that time frame, 6 percentage points in food, wine and art spending, but a 2% decrease in yachts and cruises. The narrative to this report says that this is actually quite important, that the next generation of consumers actually don't necessarily want to own a product or a service or a good, that they're happy to rent it, in fact. I think this is incredibly important for the horse racing industry, where syndicates might be more favoured by that next generation. You can't be in the business of demographics and not have cool acronyms like yuppies and dinks. Here's some of the coolest acronyms that we have developed to describe the tribes of a developed economy. In fact, I'll get to that in just a moment. Let's have a look at the rules of consumer engagement in Asia and beyond. Rising prosperity delivers more leisure time, more discretionary spending. There is spending on luxury goods and services. For example, Louis Vuitton and even Longines would fit into that market, in fact. Aspirational consumers want products and services that actually deliver self-esteem, that confirm their place in the hierarchy, that confirm that they have made a transition, if you like. Events and products must be taggable. They must be shareable in social media, in fact. And then millennials, that next generation of consumers, both in Asia and beyond, to demand 24/7 screen engagement with tailored product that enhances their personal brand. It's not just the experience, but how that experience enhances their personal brand. You need apps, you need shareable content, you need games, you need offers. This is my idea that the consumer of the future, not just in Asia but beyond, expects more than the experience of the racetrack, is my point. You need to actually have a product that goes 24/7. Here are some of the acronyms that we have developed to describe the various tribes of the developed world. The first one are the pumpkins, P-U-M-C-I-N-S, and I suspect that everyone here is a bit of a pumpkin. Stands for the professional urban middle class in nice suburbs. You can tell pumpkin men on a weekend, they wear polo shirts, chinos and boat shoes, and pumpkin women wear their activewear absolutely everywhere. You can tell if you come from a pumpkin household if there's goat's cheese in the fridge. Then, of course, you have the nettles. This is the young power couple, 35 to 45, kids under the age of 15, both partners working, household income of more than $180,000 per year. Nettle stands for not enough time to enjoy life. And you can tell if you come from a Nettle household if after the evening meal you and your partner get out your iPhone and coordinate the next day's activities. And if you email that schedule to your nanny, then you're an uber Nettle. I have in fact seen that done. We actually make these terms up. My PA came up with the term nettle. I wrote a column on it for the Australian newspaper. The paper loved it. They put it on page 3 with a big picture story. 2 days later, it popped up in the New York Times New Word Dictionary. So you really know you've made it when you've invented a new word. My personal favourite, though, are the kippers. These are the young 20-somethings that live at home with their 50-something mum and dad. K-I-P-P-E-R-S. Kids in parents' pockets, eroding retirement savings. I have a couple of kippers myself, and then everyone knows the ski generation, spending the kids' inheritance, in fact. So you've got to have some acronyms. Let's move this forward to look at the way in which sport is used as a proxy to showcase economic growth and development and success. Here is Seoul, in fact, in 1988. What is that, 30 years or so ago. Seoul is now a city of 10 million people. In 1988, if you look at the medal list of who was successful at that time in history, the only really Asian nation there is South Korea. Fast forward to Rio, 28 years later, and in fact, you have China and Japan and South Korea. This cannot happen unless there is a transformation. There is wealth generated in those countries. There is the creation of leisure time, a demand for leisure and sport and entertainment, and there is a commitment by government to invest in infrastructure, athletics tracks and swimming pools, and logically, racetracks, when you think about it. It's a symbol of success, a symbol of evolution, a symbol of the movement or the change in a country over time. You can see the rise of Asia measured in these figures. There is another way you can measure this, and this is perhaps through corporate power. The Fortune 500 global headquarter list is a list that's been around for about 20 years. We go back to 2006 and look at the cities that have headquartered the 500 largest corporations on Earth. In 2006, it was headed by Tokyo, Toyota, of course, and others based in Tokyo, then Paris, then London, then New York. Beijing had 12 global headquarters, if you like. San Francisco Bay Area is Silicon Valley, effectively. Osaka and Seoul is there. Here is the situation 10 years later. And Beijing, arguably, has taken the world by storm in terms of corporate head office, state-owned enterprises, largely, I suppose. But if you look at that, Shanghai has increased, Seoul has increased, Osaka has increased over that time frame. And more corporations means more people with spending power. It means more demand for corporate boxes. It means more demand for sponsorships. All of this must translate into an opportunity for the horse racing industry in Asia. I want to take you to two corporations and two cities. Let's compare New York and Beijing. In 2005, New York had 22 of the 500 biggest corporations on the planet headquartered in that city. Beijing had 15. 10 years later, it was 56 versus 17. If you actually have a look at one of those businesses that were headquartered in New York 10 years ago, the Verizon Group, it's a telco, the old Bell Atlantic, and you can see its turnover has gone from $72 billion to $132 billion. If you were on the board of Verizon over the last 10 years, we have done stunningly well. Our sales have increased by 82% over 10 years. Here is State Grid, which is based in Beijing. It delivers electricity. It delivers electricity to consumers. And in 2005, it had more or less the same turnover, the same GDP as Verizon, $71 billion. Here's what it's done in 10 years. Which city, which company, which corporation? Is this not proof positive of the sheer scale of growth, development, spending power, corporate power that is blossoming out of Asia? Is there a spillover effect, if you like, to a demand for leisure and entertainment at a premium level in Hong Kong, in Tokyo, in other areas where you would actually see this emerge? And I actually think that is very much the case for Asia. Let's have a look at some of the 6 big growth economies across Asia over the next 20, 30 years or so. I want to start with Japan. Here is the number of people added to Japan's labour market over 100 years. It's 1950 on the left, 2050 on the right, and I've only showed you figures up to 1990. So each one of these bars shows the net growth in 12 months, over 12 months, of the number of people presenting to the labour market. More workers, more spenders, more tax, more prosperity, more wealth. That's up to 1990. Here is the last 30 years in Japan. The labour market has contracted. The spending market has contracted. And if you look at the forecast, this is going to continue for the rest of the first half of the 21st century. The response there needs to be robotification. The response there needs to be globalisation. The success of Japan's economy and corporates cannot and will not depend on the local economy. If you are running the horse racing industry in Japan, look at these figures. Well, actually, the number of people with the capacity to buy my product is going to shrink over the next 20 or 30 years. We need to adopt a global blueprint. That's what this is saying. By looking at the big picture underlying demographics, you can set the agenda. You can't actually work out the tactical response. You can see what the general response should be. The same logic applied to Australia. Australia is a country that adds immigrants. We doubled our immigration rate 10 years ago, 200,000 people per year. And you can see that over 100 years, from 1960 through to 2050, here is a market that's going to deliver more workers, more tax, more spending, year after year. It's off a low base. It's only 25 million people live there. But if you were delivering a product or a service like horse racing in Australia, so well, it's probably a good place to invest. It's going to grow. It's going to continue to grow. We have a reasonable chance to take a share of an expanding pie in that market. That's Australia. Here is the market for Hong Kong, going from 3 million people in 1960 to 7 million people in the year 2000 to 8 million people by the middle of the 21st century. But the working age population will contract. It's following the Japan trajectory. Hong Kong must and is developing as Asia's Manhattan. one of the most globally connected places on Earth, if as measured by the number of cities that you can get to in a single flight. Around about 300 places you can get to from Hong Kong. 360 is the world record that comes out of London. Here is a global city. Here is a Manhattan-esque city that is evolving. Here is the future of Hong Kong. And I think that there is an opportunity to pick up spillover spending and corporate spending out of China over that time frame. Here is the market for China, 1960 on the left, 2060 on the right, and you can see the rising labour market during the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, right through to around about today. The one-child policy, initiated in the 1970s, comes back to reduce the spending market, if you like, the labour market, from about 2020 onwards. But I think that this will not impact the rising demand for consumer spending, because consumer spending in China will be driven by rural to urban migration. So it doesn't quite fit the model. But again, there should be a rising spending market that spills out into neighbouring countries, is the point. And here is the market for India. Over 100 years. And India, by the year 2028, from that first slide, is the third or fourth biggest economic force on the planet within 10 years' time. And you can see spending and labour and tax growing every year for 100 years. The issues, I think, in India are around about targeted, quite specific markets, instead of a broad brush opportunities, quite targeted in the major cities like Mumbai and Delhi, for example. I want to now bring you to the South Korean market. Here is a country that's gone from 25 million to 47 million to 51 million by the middle of the 21st century. And again, as countries become more successful, more prosperous, and more consumer spending, then their birth rate starts to slow down, and that's the phase that Japan, that Hong Kong, that South Korea, I think also Singapore, is moving into at the moment. And as a consequence, you need to globalise the product offer in that country. Here is some of the key consumer trends that I think are shaping spending behaviour right across both the developed world and the developing world. If you go back 80 years to look at life expectancy in both Australia and China, in 1938, the average life expectancy in a developed world like Australia was 63 years. You qualified for the age pension at 65, so you dropped dead 2 years before you got a pension back in 1938. China, of course, 41 years. And so you would say that life expectancy in Australia was about 50% more than in China 80 years ago. And there were no teenagers in 1938. You're a child for 14 years, then you're an adult. And then you're an old person at 51 or 52. If you were 50 years old and unhappy in a relationship back in 1938, you'd think, you know, what's the point? I'm going to be dead in 10 years' time. I might as well just wait this out. Whereas today, you think, I've got another 30 years of life. I think differently about being 50 if I think I'm going to live to 80, as opposed to live to 60. I've got all that time. I want leisure. I want reward. I want to harvest some of the effort that I have put in over that time frame. 40 years later, life expectancy in both Australia and China, it's kicked out now to 71 years in the developed world. Australia's not too different from Britain or from the US or Canada at that time. So you've got 6 years in retirement. So financial planning and pension planning suddenly becomes important. And you're not an old person until well into your 60s. And you have the emergence of the teenager market, a transition between childhood and adulthood with its own spending behaviour and its own income spending behaviour over that time frame. Here is where we are today, 40 years later in 2018. The average life expectancy in Australia is 82, in China it's 72. So China has gone from 50% of the Australian life expectancy 80 years ago to maybe 85% today. Here is another measure of the transition of China and of Asia. And it opens up spending power, just in the way in which the creation of the teenage market created a new market in the 1960s and the 1970s. Pop culture suddenly emerged. The Beatles arrived onto the scene at that time and galvanised an entire generation. And today you have the next generation, the Millennial Generation, in adolescence. I think you're a teenager now between 13 and 29. You delay commitment to marriage, mortgage, children and a career until 28, 29 or 30. It gives you a lot more discretionary spending time. If you're not committed to a marriage or mortgage or children or career at 21 or 22 or 23, as the baby boomers were, then you've got more discretionary spending. That discretionary spending can be spent on leisure and entertainment and on luxury goods, in fact. I think there is a market for a new stage in the life cycle to emerge between, say, 55 and 65, where you scale back. I think the model going forward is you don't work to the age of 65, get a gold watch and retire. You scale back from 55 to 60 to 65, where you actually reap the benefits of your career. And you're looking for lifestyle, you're looking for entertainment. Have a look at the rise of the demand for the cruise market. Rhine River cruises in particular hit the market for that particular demographic. And my argument is that as life expectancy increases across many Asian countries, you'll see exactly the same pattern emerge over that time frame. Let's have a look at some of the particular generations, starting with the baby boomer generation. You're a baby boomer if you're born between 1946 and 1964. You are currently aged between 54 and 72. The midpoint of the baby boomer generation is about 61 or 62. Mel Gibson is sitting right slap bang in the middle of the baby boomer generation. If you watch Mel age, you think, well, that's the aging of the baby boomers. Very hierarchical. Baby boomers were raised by a generation that touched the Great Depression, that fought in the Second World War. Don't get too uppity, don't get too ahead of yourself. Don't trust credit, don't get into debt. These are very measured people with very measured lifestyles. In fact, don't be too showy is the logic behind. But baby boomers, I think, indulged their kids. They measured their success as parents by how much they could give their kids. Indulgence. They are also known as the sandwich generation. They're dealing with their 80 and 90-something parents and their 20-something kids. But I think indulging their kids is the key point there. In a horse racing industry, I would call baby boomers primarily the owners of syndicates and horses. Then you have Generation X. Generation X sit between the baby boomers and Generation Y. Generation X is always in the wrong place at the wrong time. I regard them as the pissed off generation. They're sick of baby boomers, they're sick of Generation Y. What about me? They're the forgotten generation. They're always, they have absolutely no workplace guilt. Generation X is the first generation of women who went back to work without any guilt about it. In fact, look, kid, I work, get over it, you're not special, that's the way it is. We're actually starting to see these gender issues filter their way into the workforce and I think into the leisure and entertainment market. I've done some work for other sporting groups like golf, for example. The big issue for golf is that they will say, well, in years gone by, the male would work and then on a weekend he would play golf. And women, Generation X, say, hang on, this is not right. This is not being inclusive. What we really want is a sport or an entertainment or a pastime that delivers self-esteem that is inclusive. What sport might that be? It would play right into the thinking of that next generation. And I see that as horse racing. Yes, you can do it with your mates, but you can also do it as a couple. My point is that it is an articulated sport and entertainment, aspirational and articulated, the right sport for the times, or leisure entertainment for the times. Then you have the Millennial Generation. This is the special generation, the bubble wrap generation, many people have called it, raised by that baby boomer generation, very entrepreneurial, and in China, they're referred to as Little Emperor syndrome. In fact, very high expectations of consumer life. Apps and outings would be important. Corporate boxes would be important to pitch to Generation X. And then you have Generation Z or Generation Z. This is the children of Generation X. Their parents are very results orientated. They're educated, they're tech savvy, they're globally connected. They're the pragmatists, the first generation to mature to adulthood in a post-GFC world. Very practical people. Whereas the millennials are more dreamers, more entrepreneurial. The Generation X's, the gender, have shifted the discussion around gender. Each generation with a different nuance to shape the market, in fact. Here are some of the key points that I think is relevant that flows from all of this information for horse racing. I think one of the key strengths around horse racing is it is male and female inclusive. You can do it as a couple, you can do it as an individual. It's so articulate. You can go to watch the races, you can actually go and do the fashion thing, you can wager. There is a whole range of options. It's premium entertainment with fine dining and fashion. And of course, it offers corporate opportunities as well. The weaknesses, perhaps, and particularly I think this is the case in large cities in Asia, it requires vast land resources. You need a lot of land for a racetrack, and of course there's always competing interests. There is a limited heritage in horse racing. You don't have racetrack allocations and reserves that have been there for 100 years. You need to carve it out of a modern, growing city, and there's always a competing land use for that. And then regulatory limitations, maybe particularly in China. The opportunities, of course, the rising middle class. You can't look at the rising GDP, the rising corporate power of China, the rising values of that next generation of the millennials and Generation X and even Generation Z, and not see that there is an opportunity right here in Asia to grasp that opportunity and to take it forward. I think there are opportunities for technology-enhanced experiences, and every sporting group that I speak to will talk about artificial intelligence and artificial reality and virtual reality, taking the viewer onto the track, onto the football field, onto the cricket pitch, in a way that is 24/7 screen inclusive. That's where technology is going. It's delivering an articulated, complete package that connects with millennials and with Generation Z. And then the threats, of course, are substitute leisure activities. So a rising prosperity, rising wealth, more time to spend on yourself. Are you going to spend that gaming, cafes, bars, restaurants? Will it be golf? Will it be tennis? What other substitute leisure activities are there? And then, of course, pressure for alternative land uses other than racetracks. And then perhaps failing to respond or to new technology, not seeing the opportunity as it emerges. There is an important data set that arrived or that was completed about 2 months ago. It actually came out of Australia. And I think it's important at a global level. It actually measures household expenditure change over 7 or 8 years. Here is an analysis of 800 items of household expenditure between 2010 and 2016 by comparing household expenditure in 2010 with 2016. You can identify those parts of household spending that have increased the most over that time frame. This goes to the issue of wallet share. In a developed economy, what has been the share of wallet of sports and entertainment and leisure? Over that period, household income increased by 15%. Household spending on sports lessons increased by 114%. Household spending increased on package tours by 61%. Art galleries and museums by 50%. Eating out by 46%. It's never the numbers. The numbers are boring. It's the ability to see a bigger picture, a stronger overarching narrative. When you look at the areas of spending that have contracted over that time frame, I think it's quite instructive. Lottery ticket spending decreased by 30%. Music concert fees decreased by 23%. Cinema spending decreased by 17%. The idea here is to say, well, what's growing, what's contracting, and what links the two? And when I look at what is growing, the household wallet is spending more on articulated, tailored leisure experiences. I want a tailored sporting lesson. I want a tailored package tour. I want a cultural experience. I want to eat out. These are all individual, quite unique experiences. A lottery ticket is a game of chance. Where is the engagement there? I'm losing interest in that. The same with cinema and even golf equipment and fees, losing relevance compared to where the market is actually pushing. And the market is pushing towards tailored, articulated products and services in leisure and entertainment. And then just finally, some key takeouts that I think come from all of this. The rise in consumer culture and leisure time that we're now seeing across Asia. I think horse racing is seen as inclusive, and I think that's particularly relevant to that next generation. I see it as an articulated product, entertainment. It's not just like a lottery ticket, a game of chance. It offers fine dining, it offers fashion, it offers the excitement. You can go to a corporate box. There's a whole range of which opportunities that you can connect with it. And it's seen as a marquee symbol of economic development and personal success. It fits in with that Maslow's hierarchy of needs when you think about it. More corporate culture in Asian cities leads to more sponsors, more boxes, more owners, more attendees, all demanding a premium leisure experience. Is the horse racing industry going to compete for a share of this market? Is it going to aggressively compete for a share of this market? And I would certainly say that is where we need to be. I think also the evolution of Hong Kong as Asia's Manhattan. In many respects, over the last half century, we've seen this nexus between London and New York. Could it be that over the next 30 or 40 years, the nexus is between Shanghai and Hong Kong, maybe Tokyo, those three cities, really being the centre of gravity of rising corporate power, wealth and prosperity across the planet. And of course that spills out into a demand for leisure, entertainment and horse racing, in fact. And then finally, the centre of gravity of business clearly shifting towards Asia. I think that this provides an opportunity to deliver a blueprint for racing in Asia over the 2020s. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great.
Bernard, thank you very much indeed. Absolutely fascinating. And the way you present it, it certainly is Asia's century. We're just adding a few more chairs to the stage because we'll have two more presentations and then we'll have a panel discussion about racing as a global brand and what needs to be done to increase that brand and the profile around the world. Okay, so if Phil, if you'd like to come to the stage, if Louis, if you'd like to come to the stage, because you can, Louis, you can listen to the presentations from here. Louis Romanet is going to join us for the panel discussion. Louis is chairman of the International Federation of Horse Racing Authorities. Phil Lynch is going to be making a presentation, and Phil is CEO of media at Manchester United FC, and you don't need me to tell you, apart from the football, that Manchester United are the richest club in world football. Phil, if you want to go and have a seat, I'm going to invite Winfried to come back to the stage, because not only is Winfried, of course, the chairman of the Asian Racing Federation, Winfried Engelbrecht-Bresges is going to give a presentation now as the Chief Executive Officer of the Hong Kong Jockey Club. And the title of this, Winfried, The Creation of a Global Brand for Racing, the Challenge and Opportunity. So if you'd like to come back, I shall hand over to you again. Ladies and gentlemen, the chairman.
First of all, thank you very much, Bernard, for setting a wonderful stage, and it makes very clear that we in racing have to really look at global trends. We have to look at major developments which will decide our fate. And I think it shows that there is room for growth, that there is room for optimism. But I think we should go back and say where we are at the moment and what we have to do to take the opportunity which were outlined here. If I take you only back a little bit what we have done in relation in racing, we have seen the impact on globalization. We have diligently worked in our different federations, Asian Racing Federation, International Horse Racing Federation, to address global issues. But we have done this on a very product base. We have looked at the harmonization of race day rules. We have looked at the movement of horses. We have, in a way, discussed really how we, on a global basis, can work better and collaborate together. And I think it is definitely that we had to address certain industry issues. Comes to really the issue of medication in races, etc. We have then ventured looking at potential income streams. And maybe you remember in 2007, we made a presentation in Dubai about commingling, that this is a potential growth opportunities. And if one have seen, for example, for the Hong Kong Jockey Club, 15% of our income comes now from commingling. So it shows what you mentioned, that the globalization is definitely gives us opportunities. But I think it is in the spirit of this conference, innovate, collaborate, and transform, that I feel that we look at a wider global racing brand. And I think it's important that we, in a more holistic way, develop this global racing brand. And this cannot be done only on individual racing organizations. One has to have a wider picture. And I think this is a major platform for growth and prosperity of the industry. But before we go into what could be the global racing brand, let's in a way go back what we were. We were in a way as a brand, horse racing has a long tradition. If I look at horse racing started 4,500 before Christ, which is a lot of people would lose out in a quiz if you asked. So 300 years ago, really racing started as a sport of kings. It was very clear what the brand was. And I think it gave us this royalty, it gave us a very good brand proposition. And I think it developed very quickly from the sport of kings to the king of sports, especially in a way from an entertainment perspective, because on this game, they develop wagering. And that had a very strong appeal. We were, as racing, the only game in town. We had ensured media exposure, front page, major coverage in newspapers. And I think it was probably what has made us a little bit complacent. Racing took this for granted. So I think if one looks now fast forward where we are now, I would be good to give an as-is assessment. What I think is our position at the moment? Are we still the king of sports? So if one looks at the as-is analysis on the status of racing, I would refer to statistics, to criteria. What does it mean to be popular? And I think, therefore, we have here commonly used evaluation criteria, where you talk about the global fan base, audience, TV viewership, TV right deals, priority on the internet, popularity on the internet, relevancy of a sport throughout the year, the average salary of athletes in the top leagues, endorsement and sponsorship deals, number of countries which a sport is popular, biggest competition and number of countries represented, then the access to the general public worldwide, social media response and presence, and prominence of the sport in sports headlines and in electronic media. I think that gives you a pretty good outset what our criteria are to assess the popularity. If one looks now at the results, what are the top sports rankings? And after a look at these rankings, one would see that the clear number one is football. Football has 3.5 to 4 billion estimated fan base. Then it's followed by basketball, cricket, and with approximately 2 billion fans. Then we have tennis, volleyball, American football. I think this serves as a very good reference what these brands have done to develop their fan base. And one has to say that racing is not any longer in the top 10. Not even if you look at criteria, it's a top 20. So this is, I would call, a wake-up call. Because when you look at the assets we have, that is definitely something we can revert. Football, in a way, as a highlight, why is football so popular? One is, in a way, it's the most accessible sport. Furthermore, I think football has really developed in a way with a lot of people around the globe kicking a ball. But I think the first really global player was Pelé, where people around the world identified, in a way, this was a beautiful game. And it is, for a lot of people, not only a game, it's a lifestyle. If you then look at the Football World Cup, it is watched by 3.9 billion, if you look at the FIFA World Cup. The final match is watched alone by 700 million. Football is the most popular sport if one looks at the social media. In social media, I think, again, the most fan on the social media are Real Madrid and Barcelona. Having said this, Manchester United, especially fueled by the mega TV deals, is by far the most valued sports club in the world. And if you look at the income, Manchester United is clearly ranking #1. It's at the moment at 800 million. The value is 4.8 billion of the club, and the yearly revenue is 850 million and will hit 1 billion. So now, in a way, after Pelé, if you look now, the stars with global appeal, it is very clear that football players, Messi, Ronaldo, Neymar, are real heroes. And everything they do, their lifestyle, is reported. It's not only what they do on the field. It is what they do to create this 365 days, 24-hour coverage and attention to, in a way, the sport. Racing, in a way, has, what we concluded, lost a little bit of appeal. But if you look, there is still, like Great Britain, where they're in the top 10, like Hong Kong, where we, due to maybe competition, are the #1. So we can, in a way, show in certain countries, you still have a great representation of racing. But I think the best is what we, in a way, summarize how is racing perceived as a sport? And that comes to the brand. So the ranking is exactly in this criteria, number 25. And I think it's very important probably to understand what is, if you want to go to the next consumer segments which have growth potential, what is maybe holding us back. So horse racing is, in the definition here, is one of the most Asian sports and enjoys a rich history. Being very expensive and historic in nature, this sport is not quite popular among the general public. Nevertheless, it does have its share of fans out there. It's mainly followed as a gambling sport. And I think this is something which I think we should note, that our brand is dominated in the view of a lot of people as gambling. And I will come later to the aspect why, even it is our live stream, why we have to change the perception if we want to reach out to the next customer generation. Looking at the market share we have in wagering, it has dropped. It is still significant. It is, if one looks at 2002, we peaked at 120 million global revenue in turnover. It has been flat. Our market share in gaming is 6%. And I think it's interesting to note when we talk about competition, there is, yesterday was a Supreme Court ruling in US which will open, likely, the market for gaming in the US outside of Nevada to sports. Especially in a way, the NBA pushed this issue. That will be a significant challenge and maybe opportunity at the other end for our US colleagues, because it's a completely different dimension of competition now in the US. But the conclusion is, when we look at where we are, it is very clear that we have to broaden our fan base. And I think it is that we have, in our opinion, and I will refer later to market research, clearly have the shift from gaming as a main brand to leisure and entertainment. And I think it's, and I would like to refer to some work we did in Hong Kong, which in a way, when we faced a significant decline of turnover, where our turnover came down from 92 billion to 59 billion. So what we looked at, what we have to do differently to obviously in a very growing economy, why we could not tap into it. And I don't want to go too much in the detail of it, but it shows one aspect. We went into a very detailed customer segmentation. We wanted to really understand what the value proposition is, what in a way drives then potential growth. And we captured it practically in main segment like race that people who was looking for a lifestyle, racing as a lifestyle. Then we had a second major category, what we call racing hobbyists, and we had the money-driven regulars. And money-driven regulars only want to have wagering opportunity, don't give me an F&B experience, do this as efficient as you can. But what we could see that we were not tapping, especially in the value which were offered by, and I don't go into now the details of your description of which kind of customer groups you classify as pumpkins, etc. But we could very clearly see that a middle class, a growing middle class in Hong Kong with significant spendable income, 85% of the population in Hong Kong has a gaming propensity, that was a segment we could tap in if we offered the right products, the right services, but more to offer the right experience. And that was where we, in a way, focused on these segments, especially if you look at the racing hobbyist with high valuable income. And when we looked then deeper into the 25 to 45, we could see they had an interest in racing, but they didn't want to go racing because we didn't have the right offerings, and we had the wrong image. We were seen as the racing uncles with newspapers, and this is nobody in this segment want to be connected to. So then with technology, heavy investment in technology, in experience, investment in the whole infrastructure from the race course, from CRM programs, we were able to shift this. But one of the key issues was we had to change our brand position. We had to be seen not only as hardcore gaming, we had to be seen as entertainment. And that was a key fundamental shift we did. And we, in a way, were clear the entertainment value we had to dial up. And we positioned racing as a sport, as a world-class sport. Because people in Hong Kong are very aspirational. They don't want to be associated with anything which is not top class. So these can be key elements and anchors has helped us in this brand. We have put the world-class racing sport into our purpose and core value statements. In the purpose statement, we state that we, in a way, as a world-class racing club, we act continuously for the betterment of the society. So we created with our, especially the connectivity to charity, we could shift our brand to. But the other aspect in our value system, and I want to only highlight this, is uncompromising integrity. Because this is a key issue for our sport, where we have, in relation to any other sport, an advantage. Because we have, in our sport, measures with racing control, with our intelligence we have, where we monitor the integrity of the sport, which not many other sports do with gambling. If one looks then at the outcome of this, and we had two aspects, world-class racing, and one can see that we have a significant improvement, especially in those segments who are non-wagering public in relation to perceive us as world-class, and that they saw racing as a sport and not only as a gaming opportunity. And in a way, to dial up the entertainment element, that this is an option not only for the older generation, that this is an option for the younger generation. We developed a brand we call the Happy Wednesday brand, and this is every Wednesday a major attraction in the city, where in a way we have young people coming, and young people say it's cool to go to racing, which I think helped us tremendously in shift of the perception of racing being for the older, elder generation. And better than talking about it, I would refer to a video.
The bar closes and you feel like falling down, I'll carry you home tonight.
We used especially music, because F&B, etc., all these offerings we had, but we used especially music to have a completely new engagement. So if one looks now, what is the brand of racing? And I want to, in a way, probably only highlight briefly what brand stands, because a lot of people see it with a logo, etc., and it's a little bit more. So first of all, the brand is a promise to our customers on who we are and what they can expect from us, and it should differentiate us from our competitors. I think each brand should have its own identity, which is how we want our customers to perceive our products and our brand itself. And each brand has positioning. So what creates a unique impression on customers' mind, what they associate our brand with, something specific and desirable. And I think to allow our racing fans base to grow in the fast-changing landscape, I feel necessary that we have to focus on the element of world-class racing sport, and that we have to focus on entertainment. I will not talk about entertainment too much, because we will have a separate session about it. But why, in a way, we come back in the brand positioning, why, from our experience, and why I would advocate on a more global level, what is necessary to position horse racing not major as a gambling activity, but as a world-class sport. If you look at the key elements of racing, you have from the horses, the jockeys, the races as competition, you have the events, you have the race courses, you have the wagering products and operations, you have racing authorities with the rules and regulations, you have the racing clubs and organizations, you have stable staff, trainers, but I would advocate the key issue and the key elements of what the world-class racing sport is. It is, and you could call it key sub-brands, it's horses, jockeys, and races. And I think it is not only about what we do a lot of times, a very product marketing. And it's a lot of times very strongly linked to wagering. We have to create a much more emotional connection to really, in a way, position ourselves differently and to reach out to the middle class, which is growing in most countries. So when we look at what really differentiates us, what are the elements? It is definitely the thoroughbred racehorse. The customers can associate with, because you have the attributes of speed, elegance, strength, fighting spirit, can-do spirit. You have the jockeys who are world-class athletes What I found interesting, even if you talk to some seasoned racegoers, they don't recognize what kind of top athletes jockeys are. When you see, in a way, when you tell them that the heart rate of a jockey in a finish goes up to 170 heartbeat, they don't know it, because they see them more as instrumental for gaming. And I think it comes then to the race itself, which I think is the most competitive sport, where you have within, if you design the product right, within very few seconds, you see, in a way, the decision of the outcome. And I think the live events are a unique platform. When you go then to the elements, if you look at star horses, and I could go now to the star horses in the world, which are well known within the racing fans, but which horses have made it outside of the racing fan space? And the interesting thing is that I have here for Australia Far Lap, where I think some people reminded me that New Zealand claims this too, so I will be a little bit careful attribute this completely to Australia. But you have great horses, in a way, from Secretariat, Seabiscuit, American Pharoah. The interesting part is that probably the horse who had the most attention was Seabiscuit. And why? Because it was more than a racehorse. It was a whole story you could tell. Secretariat was a marvelous racehorse. Even I was, when we did some research, saw then when Nixon was impeached, still it made, in a way, the front page of the Time, etc. But if you look at Secretariat, if you look at Seabiscuit, he touched the heart of people. There was a story behind it. If you look at other countries like Brigadier Gerard, Nijinsky, Frankel, wonderful racehorses. But did they make it outside of the racing fans? You look at now Japan, Deep Impact or Favre, Kitty-san Black, only as examples. I would say that Japan has the strongest branding of the sport of a racehorse, for racehorses, where you have really followers, and this is something we can learn. In Hong Kong, we had some great horses, especially Silent Witness was a marvelous sprinter, the best in the world, but what reached really out while more people were attached to him was not his race performance. It was, he stood as a symbol during SARS, where people see it as hope, as the spirit of Hong Kong competitiveness. And if you look now at Australia, and coming back to a marvelous filly like Wings, racing fans around the world know her, but do they know her really? And have we be able to achieve to get her outside of the racing cycle, to get her, in a way, attachment to a wider fan base, which we then could leverage to attract them to racing? World-class jockeys. Again, we can have here a list from the different countries where you see, in a way, the famous names of jockeys. But which are the jockeys who really go outside of the circle of racing, where people identify them as their stars? And when you do a poll in, for example, in US, Ortiz is a marvelous jockey. He won the most wins in 2016, had the highest earning in 2017, but he is basically not known outside of the US. The most probably impressive jockey people remember is Shoemaker. So why we have not been able to get outside of our circles? We have a poll in UK would show even Ryan Moore is very well known as a globe-trotting jockey. If you look, in a way, his global presence is much higher, how he competes and where he competes, than any other sportsman. But he is not well known out of the racing cycle. The one who is most known is still Lester Piggott. We have world-class events, and I can again highlight these world-class events we have, where, in a way, you have a following, not only in a regional base or fan base, which has a wider fan base, but I think if you look at really, and I want to take two examples, who capture a much wider audience. One is the Melbourne Cup. The Melbourne Cup is sporting-wise only a handicap, but it is a race who stops the nation. So why we have been able to, the Melbourne Cup, to capture this? From a commercial value, the Kentucky Derby is known as a brand outside of racing. And this is, in a way, the best thing is if you see at commercial value, there was a JP Morgan analyst recently valued the Kentucky Derby with 1.8 billion US dollars. And the rumor was that there was a takeover bid on the table for 2 billion to buy the brand of the Kentucky Derby. You can see racing has the ability to create significant value, to be outside of only the racing fans, but it is, in a way, something we more strategically have to work on. So what we have done, especially within the IGFA, in the partnership with Longines, what we have done, in a way, to promote our key elements of races, horses, and jockeys. So we have created the world ranking of the best 100 Group 1 races, the best racehorse rankings, and the best jockeys. But I would say it's very good. But what we do, we only talk to ourselves. We talk to the existing fan base. We have not, in a way, reached out to a wider fan base and portrayed them not only with figures, but how we create emotional connectivity. And that is what I would like to advocate, to think about a master brand which creates an emotional attachment, which in a way then fits into the lifestyle and the entertainment. If one looks at this master brand, I would say the key elements we have, what we said, is the jockeys, the horses, and the races, which I think especially those wonderful sporting competition. But there is one element which is the basis and foundation of everything we do, and this is the integrity. That is the commitment to anti-doping, and last not least is horse welfare. Because if we want to go to a wider brand campaign on a global basis, if we have not these fundamentals in order, we will have not a chance to really build a global brand. And I think it is this commitment to the highest integrity we have to have as a sport. We have, in a way, systems and processes, institutions in place to do so. We have done, in a way, a very, very strict definition of integrity in our rules. And I think we have to expenses that it's not only a rules, that is part of the value of every participant in the sport. That goes from trainers, jockeys, owners. Because I think when you look at recent incidents we had in the sport, that we have too many people who try to bend the rules. And therefore, it needs a strong commitment from everybody in the sport as a value. Then the commitment to medication-free racing, an absolute must. And there is no room for any ambiguity, especially when it comes to prohibited substance, when it comes to anabolic steroids, which is an absolute hygiene for our brand. And the ARF has, again, in a way, a strong commitment, and we had passed yesterday a resolution to further, in a way, push this issue on a global basis. Because if you look at reputation, your whole global brand can collapse very quickly if you are not, in a way, focused on this issue. So what is the building of a global brand to a holistic brand strategy? One, I see the role of integrity is the role of the racing regulators. It is the role of federations like the IGFA, the ARF. But when it comes to building a global racing brand, I see this more in the field of racing organizers. And this global racing brand should position racing with its uniqueness of combining the riding skills of the top jockeys with the fastest, most elegant horse, the thoroughbred, and the most enticing competition, that's the race itself. We, in a way, have to create a much higher brand awareness of our equine stars. We have to think about not position these awareness mainly as a product. We have to create emotional attachment. And this is a significant change how we do our marketing. and how this links to the overall brand we want to create. I feel strongly that we have, with the racing itself, with the competition itself, we have a real entertainment element which in a way creates excitement, which in a way you can only in a way really see and feel when you have to bring people to the races. So for the live stage is the key element in a holistic branding strategy too. But I think I only could say, when we want to go into this exercise, it needs a really strategic approach. It is not on an individual basis by one race course to another. It needs a combination of major players in the racing industry, especially the race organizers, to do so. And I think we have a unique chance to create a really global positioning for racing. It would allow us to tap into different income streams, which in a way we definitely would need for a further growth. And I think that with the lifestyle position of racing, with really the entertainment positioning, that looking at the demographics, look at the potential we have, this is our unique chance. And I would, in a way, ask our major racing organizations in the world, the racing organizers, hopefully to be able to share, in a way, this vision. Secondly, in a way that we should share the same value if it comes to the integrity of the sport, but we have a unique platform which we, in a way, can really further expand to create a global impact of a sport we love and we are passionate about. Thank you very much.
Winfried, thank you very much. Some years ago when I was working for BBC Sport, the department did a marketing survey of viewers around the world, and we were told that it would help us make the editorial decisions about our running orders and the sports that the viewers wanted to hear about, the top 3 in order, and it won't surprise you: football, tennis, and Formula One. So it's absolutely fantastic for the Asian Racing Conference this year to welcome the next speaker, because everyone can learn from the very best. And Phil Lynch, the CEO of media at Manchester United. And you know what that means, because he's going to talk about his club as a global brand. Phil.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. By way of introduction, my name is Phil Lynch. I joined Manchester United in January 2017 as the CEO of the media group, with a bit of the task of what we're speaking about this week in terms of how do we migrate and transition the business, giving all of the different changes that are happening in the media landscape, and how do we stay relevant, and how do we stay focused on that consumer fan base, and how do we continue to grow it. Before we get into it, I would really like to thank Winfried for the hospitality. Had a wonderful day yesterday, really enjoyed the opening ceremony as well as the dinner, and had a wonderful trip through traditional Seoul yesterday, so thank you very much. And then to kickstart things, I think we'll start off with a video, but I think here is the clicker.
Eager to see the young men whose fame has run round Europe.
Missed again. What a player this boy is. He's got another. Scholes hits one. Oh, what a goal. But they've completed the most famous league and cup double in sport. And it's saved it. United again. Are the champions yet again.
burdened by the history that they create. They know what is expected of them. They are Manchester United.
Great, so for context and a little bit of background, as I said, I joined about a year and a half ago. Prior to that, I spent about the first 15, or not the first 15, but the last 15 years, most recently running global partnerships at Yahoo with a heavy focus on sports. I heard Bernard's presentation earlier and was brought on there for about 2 years to manage the sale to Verizon, so it was good to get the Verizon piece in there. And then for about 10 years prior to that, I started and built the digital business at Sony Pictures. So, you know, as Winfried and I were speaking, we thought that it would be a great idea. You'll see some of these slides, and I think the brand attributes of the core business, which are obviously global reach and appeal, the history of the club, our commitment to youth, as well as obviously success on the pitch, are kind of throughout all of these slides. And I think I'll probably pivot a little bit more to speak to some of the operational tactics that Winfried covered this morning about how we address those challenges. So it's obviously clear we have a big brand, a lot of success. However, given what's happening in the market, there are a lot of challenges that we face on a day in and day out basis. So moving on, I think if you look in terms of context, in terms of the value of sports, this is a very interesting slide in terms of the CAGR year over year of what the Premier League has seen in terms of growth of this traditional business. What's important to note is on the bottom of the slides, you'll see the renewal periods. So what's interesting is a lot of these sports brands continue to grow and extend their linear television deals. We, as a collective unit at the Premier League, have decided to keep those extensions kind of minimal because we believe that over time, despite what's happening in the TV landscape, the value of our rights will continue to grow. It is extremely interesting to see, and the way we feel that is, yes, there are proliferation of devices and fragmentation. However, live sports is still what drives the TV industry. So whereas other sports, scripted dramas, can be DVR'd or TiVo'd or even a Netflix or a Hulu, live sports, people need to be there at the moment. They want to share the emotion and the passion that's happening during the game. So this is kind of a continuation in terms of our thinking around television rights. We addressed this a little bit earlier. I think, again, as a point of comparison, on the right-hand side, you can see the valuation. Winfried spoke a little bit about two very big clubs in Spain that are obviously extremely successful. They happen to have two of the biggest sports stars in the planet, but when you look at terms of the value of what is happening in terms of the value that they drive from TV rights from their home market compared to what's happening within ours, which is the UK, quite impressive in terms of the growth and the continuation of growth on that side. So this is a very interesting slide, and again, going back to my earlier point, a fantastic slide and one we're very proud of, however, one that presents a ton of challenges for us. So if you look at the overall business, it's about 659 million followers. That means that they are one of, a lot of people nowadays follow at least one or two clubs. So we have about 659 million followers that follow us along with one other team. If you look at the fan number, it's about a little bit south of 400 million. And obviously excited to be here, and a big piece of that audience is based in Asia. I think what's very interesting now going into the challenges that we face around this number is you really have to start to think about, when you look at a fan base the size of this, there's all different demographics, all different ages, all different economic status, all different genders. And in a world where consumers demand personalization and a direct dialogue with a brand, that presents a challenge in terms of content creation. And I think an example of that is our website is about 60% under the age of 25. Our linear television network is an average age of 54. And then we actually have 2 to 3 million social followers kind of on Facebook and Instagram over the age of 65. So it's no secret to everybody here in the room. all of those different demographics tend to consume content differently. So one of the challenges for us is how do we actually create our content and target that content to speak individually to each one of these guys and each one of these demographics. Couple more points of reference in terms of popularity. This is a US-specific slide, but I think this kind of talks about in terms of the growth and the attraction that we get with our 3 billion cumulative TV audience. So slide speaks to itself, but I think what's interesting is 9 of the all-time 10 Premier League broadcasts have included our brand. So again, just a lot of powerful activity around our brand and around live TV. And I think our job, and I think one of the things that the Racing Association is working on, is how do you keep that brand relevant and how do you keep fans engaged outside of what in our case is a 90-minute live event, which happens to be on television. I don't think kind of need to go through each one of these, but the story of here is obviously, again, continual brand, but we do have work to do to maintain the status. My remit of coming on to the club was to continue to build reach and engagement with the theory that more reach and engagement leads to an increase in revenue, which has happened to date. But again, when you're starting with 659 million followers, that presents challenges as well of how do you continue to grow and not plateau. So overall, I think one of our main approaches as an organization is the O&O assets that we build, that we develop, and how we kind of maintain and keep our brand very close to our heart and maintain control of it at all times. So the top 4 are the competition committees that manage our games. I think obviously the 2 leagues and then the international competitions as well. Our live games are situated within a centralized rights structure managed by the Premier League. But I think, again, what's interesting is of our 4 main businesses from there, we have venue, which is kind of ticketing and security. We have a sponsorship business, which speaks to ourselves, or speaks for itself. We have a retail merchandising business, and then this 4th piece, which is media and content. And what's interesting from a media and content point of view is we are both a vertical business and a horizontal business. So the way consumers are interacting with clubs and brands, it is actually our media and content job to support the other 3 elements of our business. So again, at times challenging as you are tasked with a specific P&L to manage and to run, but at the same time helping and supporting all of these clubs, or not all of these clubs, all of these other operating units as well. In terms of our media pillars, so now I think we'll probably get into a little bit more of the specifics in terms of our operational tactics. But again, the #1 mandate is to grow global reach and engagement. And I think what's interesting there, going back to the linear television slides, is this trend towards direct to consumer. So yes, the revenue for the TV rights broadcasts are spectacular. Winfried and I were speaking about this at dinner last night. However, you don't control that customer. You don't control the data that comes from the TV providers, and the data that you do get ultimately will not provide you enough insight into how do you drive your business and your content creation moving forward. So as you start to develop that direct dialogue with consumers, you start to understand how they are engaging with your brand, when they're dropping off certain pieces of content, and it can really help you actually optimize the business moving forward. Second piece, I think we are a bit lucky. It was interesting hearing the story about jockeys and horses in terms of your talent. We are fortunate enough in the fact that a lot of our talent itself are personalities in and of themselves. So we'll get into that a little bit later with an example that I provide around the signing of Alexis Sanchez. But what's interesting is there obviously are television networks globally, whether that be NBC, BT, Sky, that have access to our players as well. So it's not just about access, but it's about how do you create unique access, how do you create a unique voice and tone, because frankly, we don't want to just do what BT and Sky are doing. They are very well invested, they do their jobs very well, so it's about how do we create content that's a little bit more compelling or a little bit more different, and we'll get into a little bit in terms of the consistency of the voice and tone a little bit later. Goes without saying on the sponsorship side, global activations. as well as a scalable infrastructure. Unfortunately, I think for all of us, we're in a time where media in and of itself requires significant investment, both in terms of infrastructure, but as well as talent and resources. That was a question that I get quite a bit, that how is the American guy coming and running a media business at Manchester United? And I think ultimately the club was looking for insight from Silicon Valley to kind of help build these direct-to-consumer products and understand how those infrastructures work. And then ultimately cannot underestimate the power and the importance of data and analytics. And it's amazing, number one, the investment it takes to embed analytics correctly within your organization, but it will ultimately shorten your meeting cycles down by probably about 50 to 60%, because you'll sit around a table and you'll all have, you know, the individual focus groups of 2 sons or 2 daughters or my father. However, the data will actually give you the answer in terms of what content you should be creating and where it should live. This is a slide that to me is extremely important, because I think as you start to look at how you create content, it really needs to fit into your brand. So what you'll see here is on the left-hand side is a little bit more of our, what we refer to as off-site, or kind of off-network, which is kind of our social channels, as well as like a place like YouTube. And what you'll see is those places, because they are not our core O&O, they allow us to be a little bit more conversational, a little bit more fun, a little bit more celebratory, or very emotional. So these are also the platforms where you'll start to see, obviously, a lot more of the younger demographic. So it allows us to kind of be a little bit more fun and a little bit more clever in terms of what we're doing, but really driving that dialogue and that one-to-one relationship. As you shift over to our O&O assets, you see that there kind of starts to be a little bit more of a serious element here, where you know, you kind of focus on that premium aspect, a little bit more immersive. I think what's interesting now on the left-hand side your guys left, the average attention span for the internet user right now is around 8 seconds. So when you're capturing them on these platforms, you have to kind of get to them very quickly, immediate. And one of the other interesting pieces around this is you're competing with time. So there was a time where we were competing with other sports products, other sports leagues, but that's no longer the case. As everything now is a function of time, you're competing with political elections, Game of Thrones, and it's a matter of, if that individual is in their living room or on their phone at a particular time, what are they scrolling through? And if you don't happen to be in that feed at that moment, you're actually forgotten. So you'll hear a lot of conversations around frequency of posting, what is the kind of right level or frequency of when do you make content and push it to your users, and frankly, the answer is you cannot overpost, because what happens is you only have that one moment to capture users when they're in that feed, and if you're not there, they're completely lost. So again, we have a very interesting dynamic. We talked about it last night again at dinner. In terms of the right-hand side of this screen, we have a very hardcore, passionate audience, very UK-based, don't really want things necessarily to change or migrate, and they view things very much as a football club. You have a very large and emerging left-hand side, which isn't as maybe passionate or partisan as some of the folks on the right-hand side, but it's that balance of trying to keep both of them happy, because they're obviously both extremely important to us, but it's about keeping that balance right. Moving on, here's an overview of our social media connections. We're just shy of about 160 million followers globally right now. There's some interesting tidbits here. I know as we looked about football as a sport compared to maybe the NBA, we have more followers than the top 4 NBA teams combined. On MUFC, on Twitter, it's the most tweeted hashtag ever in terms of the platform that's been around for 10 years. We're the #1 football club on Sina Weibo and WeChat. We just launched on YouTube about 2 months ago, which I know is crazy, but for those of you that are Manchester United fans, you will know that we are very rarely first, but there was a great quote after we launched YouTube, which, you know, a lot of our clubs or other competitors have been on there for maybe 10 to 15 years. They had a great quote that said, Manchester United is never the first to the party, but when they come, they're always the best dressed. So what's happened in the first 6 to 8 weeks, we are the fastest growing sports channel that's ever been on the platform. And we continue to see growth. We've already surpassed all of the NBA teams. Within 5 hours, we surpassed every NFL team, as well as every Major League Baseball team. So again, there was a lot of thought in terms of what kind of corpus of content will we launch with. We launched with over 120 individual pieces of content. We did not repurpose content for Twitter or Facebook for YouTube. Or sorry, we didn't double post content. We actually repurposed it and made it specific for YouTube. And what's interesting here, and what I would highly suggest, is you can't look at these as kind of a bucket of off-partner distribution. Each one of them has their own compelling and unique value proposition. So Facebook, for example, tends to refer a lot of traffic. Twitter happens to be now and news. Somebody like a YouTube is obviously more video focused, and Instagram obviously becomes more image focused. So as you start to look at each one of these platforms, you have to kind of individualize them and cut your content specific for each. So if the strategy currently is you create 1 2-minute video because you think it's good for a social network and you put it up on every social network, that's not a long-term winning strategy. You actually have to kind of think about how to address each one of them specifically. And for kind of points of context in terms of how we deliver this, despite 2 clubs having more followers than us, we are actually the most engaged football club in the world. And what happens in terms of the English Premier League, we are responsible for over 50% of the engagement that actually happens on all these platforms. So what happens is if you took all of the other clubs, Manchester City, Chelsea, Arsenal, Tottenham, all the way down to team number 19, and added them all together, they still don't have the amount of interaction that we have. And I think that's, again, by the focus and just the maniacal focus that we place on each one of these platforms. An example of this is when we did the Alexis Sanchez player signing. Obviously, player signings happening with everybody. Every team does them. What we did here, I don't know if anybody saw it in the room, but Alexis loves 2 things in his life, or 3 things: family, he loves his dogs, and he actually enjoys playing the piano. So we did an amazing unveiling where he was playing the piano in the middle of Old Trafford. And it broke all sorts of records. And as a point of comparison, it was 75% more interaction than what PSG got when they announced the Neymar signing. So, you know, there's typical ways of you do the signing the contract, or you have him walking into the locker room. But the idea is we're trying to create this emotional connection with these users. Depending on where you fall in that demographic of our audience, some of these players are relatable or not. Some of them are making $1 gazillion a week where people can't relate to them. So by bringing out and showing the piano, it kind of makes it more relatable from that perspective. So in each one of those, each new player signing in terms of tier A, B, and C, we kind of come up with new ideas and have very good brainstorming sessions. We talked a little bit about YouTube already, so don't need to spend too much time focusing on that, although I would ask you to go on and subscribe. But MUTV is a very interesting opportunity for us as well. So for those that don't know, MUTV is a 20-year-old television network, has historically been focused in the UK with a very passionate fan base, and then as well as linear distribution globally into about 35 million homes. When I first joined 15 months ago, I said, all right, that's fantastic. Can I look at the data? Who's consuming what? What are the day parts? How are everybody? What's working, what's not? And what happened was nobody could explain to me which shows were working, and other than very basic tune-in data for particular shows. So about 6 months ago, we created a mobile application that will continue to roll out on additional platforms quickly for tour. This summer, we'll be launching on some of our connected television platforms, Apple TVs, Roku, so on and so forth. But what this has allowed us to do is, one, is we control that direct relationship. We now have paying customers in over 125 global markets. The average age of the channel has gone from 54 ages linearly to about 32 years of age digitally. And obviously that then provides us more insight into how does that channel evolve. As you start to think about the global expansion of that channel, and it being very UK focused now, the list of opportunities and challenges are just forever. And an example of that is perhaps some of the talent that we use for the network in the UK might not resonate very well with the Korean audience or with the Japanese audience or with the audience in India or even the United States. So as we're going through a lot of that thinking now in terms of identifying particular talent and splitting that feed into multiple regions so we can optimize time periods as well as content, particularly maybe even launch geo-specific content linearly throughout that system. So another interesting thing for this is we don't control our live games, which are distributed linearly with the EPL, but we do secure the rights and keep the rights exclusively for our summer tour games on here, as well as we're trying to build that expectation around live programming. We've secured the rights for several World Cup qualifiers, as well as these most recent friendlies, but we just want to build that experience of people coming to the channel and realizing that there's going to be live football there. These are some of the partners globally of where we've distributed in terms of those 35 million homes. This is, we had already spoken about that. And then ultimately, Man United and our mobile app. For those that are fans, we have a very old website. It hasn't been updated in about 10 years. However, as of last week, we just released a beta version of that site, which is beta.manunited.com. And that's obviously a lot more focused on this younger demographic, snacking on content, more immersive, very interactive. So very excited about that. And with that will also come a new, and the first time ever, that we would have a global mobile application. So a lot of exciting opportunities there. And then ultimately, again, speaking to multiple demographics, we still do invest in print. We have a Matchday program that we release at least twice a week, which is 100 pages of very premium, long-form editorial content. There is discussions about how do we kind of maybe put that behind a registration wall, because I think what you're going to start to see now with privacy is you really want to drive users behind that registration wall so you know who they are, you can target them effectively. So it's about how do you come up with those very interesting kind of nuggets to make it very interesting to push somebody. It needs to be a value exchange. And if you can put premium content behind a registration wall, you ultimately will get people to register, and then it becomes extremely cyclical because then you can target them content. I will know that they're a fan of Marcus Rashford, so I don't need to show them content about Alexis Sanchez, and it just kind of keeps going, and then ultimately the engagement continues. So I know I'm a couple minutes over here, so I apologize, Winfried, but I think overall, in quick summary, I think it's extremely important to establish a voice and tone and stay absolutely consistent on that voice and tone. You have to have users, you have to create that expectation, they have to know what to expect, and they have to know when it's going to come. You have to be unique, and you have to add value. Best example for this is the music industry, right? There's people that make music, and then there's the consumer that listens to music. And if in between there, if you're not doing anything to help that process, you're kind of worthless. So you obviously have to add value. There's too many options out there for consumers now. Think globally, act locally. I think what's interesting here is we translate our content in over 20 languages, which again is a Herculean effort, but it's very important to do in terms of making people feel like we're speaking to them directly. We talked about the shift towards direct-to-consumer and innovation and the CRM tie-in, and then ultimately using analytics to drive your business forward. So with that, I know we'll be kind of moving over to a panel, but again, thank you very much. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Perfect. Lovely. Phil, thank you very much indeed. So instruction from the world's richest club. And as I said, we can all learn from that, can't we? So you've met three of these gentlemen already, and I introduced Louis, but Louis Romanet, who is here with us, chairman of the International Federation of Horse Racing Authorities. So Louis, shall we start with you, as we haven't heard from you yet? I'd like to, if you don't mind, take you back 10 years. Start in 2008, briefly, give us an explanation of the strategies that racing has employed in terms of branding to bring it to where it is today.
I will go back a little more and start in 1968. 50 years ago when I left the university, who was on strike with all the students in Paris, as you remember, protesting for their freedom. I'm from the generation of the baby boom, even if I don't look like now a baby. I must say that I stayed there because there was nothing else to do while racing was going on during the strikes, which shows that it can be stronger than what happens in your country. The fact that every activity was stopping one after the other, and we in fact stopped racing because of the lack of police and security. But 2 years later, we were starting the European pattern, which was the first trial to classify the races in the European countries, which was progressively extended to the rest of the world, and which created the graded and group races all over the world. But at that time, and until some years ago, very clearly, it was a constellation of individual prestigious events that were integrated in these different parts, part 1, part 2, part 3, and the groupings. But there was no real organization of global competition, either a championship or a premium league or some tour, until we in fact started in 1999 the Emirates World Racing Championship Series, which was a trial to have a circuit of races around the world. And it shows how difficult it was to establish it. We had Emirates had put $5 million on the table for 3 years, for each year. And we started discussing the top organizer of the world in order to have one race every month. And it was very difficult because, you know, in the first part of the year, you have the classic season, so the 3 years old do not travel and do not run against the older horses. Then progressively, you have the main 3 years old and upwards. So we decided to do something based on 1.25 miles, 1.5 miles, in order to have a race everywhere around the world and about one every month. But finally, it didn't succeed for a lot of reasons. The main reason was the fact that it was, in fact, the best horse traveling that were awarded. It was not the best horses of the world because of the value of the horses, of the classical program you had in the different countries. It was very difficult. It's not like a Formula One. We were trying a Formula One system and it didn't work. Finally, Emirates dropped down and we stopped it. And what we saw appearing was local festival. And the opening of international racing in many countries like Japan, like the appearance of Dubai, created this big time of the year where you had the Dubai World Cup, we had the Hong Kong series that have been also developing later on. So it was a big initiative to have top racing days. The Breeders' Cup was probably the most spectacular one, which happened at that time. And we had the ARC, we put a lot of Group 1s. The idea was to have major racing days instead of this constellation of prestigious events. Bon, we have been trying to get together in order to find out, but one of the points which has been making it difficult was the fact that we are not a sports federation. IFHA is a regulatory board. We are recommending best practice, which means we do not own the rights of these big events. When you're talking about all IOC, the International Olympic Committee federations, they all own the rights, the TV rights, they organize the events, they get the revenue from it. And at the same time, there was a big change because the sports was saying, you are a gambling activity, we are free of gambling, and it was a big change. And the journalists that working in the paper were not considered, the racing journalists are sports journalists. They were considered as gambling people that were recommending you to the winners, and in no way were promoting the sport.
Okay, just slightly more briefly, if you don't mind.
I mind.
Tell me about your organization. You say it's a regulatory body, but it's partnership with Longines, which is a blue chip company, of course. Tell us briefly about that and what others can learn about this partnership that you've entered with Lynch?
I think that was a very important thing which happened. When they came first, they came in the show jumping event, and then they came to the racing. Clearly, the very important part was that we are the only sports in the world where you have male and female competing together against each other, whether it's athletes, human athletes or horse athletes. They are competing against each other, and we have the best against each other. And that makes it very popular. So we've been trying to look at the brand values of the horse racing industry for many years in order to prepare our promotion, national or international promotion. Well, clearly, the tradition is very strong. It's a sport of passion. It's clearly a competition. It's the selection of a breed. We must never forget the fact that we are selecting a breed, which gives us a different approach. You were talking about the values of the football players, Neymar. It's impressive, but if you look at the price of the nomination of Galileo, you can also find some individuals, athletes in the racing industry that would be at the top of the market, but it's a totally different approach of the market. And I totally support the approach of Winfried of a global brand. And with Longines, what was important is they already had their brand values. It's elegance, performance, and tradition were the three key brand values. We share them. I think for us, and I insist on what Winfried said about entertainment, I think we are an international entertainment sports very clearly. And when we modernize a racecourse, we've just done it with Longchamp, a lot, Ascot has done it some years ago. When you spend 140 million euros or 240 like Ascot, very clearly you are concerned about using your facilities all year round to not just for the racing slice, and that's where the entertainment is becoming a priority. The challenge also is the integrity, as Winfried mentioned, and the integrity for us is very important. In the old time, the sports journalists were looking at the racing journalists saying, oh, you have gambling, it's irregular, there is a lot of illegal betting and so on. And now the sports is facing on a regular basis problems, and I must say that my feeling is that the integrity in racing today is above the global integrity in the sport, especially individual sports, when there is only one person playing against another. And we must try to find within these different brand values what we support the sport. And Longines has been helping us with the rankings. We created our rankings, which has been a complete change over the last 10 years. That was not existing, but we still don't have the horses competing. If you look at today, the best horses, you have Winx, you have horses that she has not been racing outside Australia. She's a fantastic mare,
okay.
But we would like to have more competition.
Okay. Louis, you mentioned some really important points, so let's pick up on these. Phil, I'd like to start with you, but I want to talk about this issue, Winfried, that you're pushing racing towards that leisure and entertainment market. And you say there are going to be other sessions about that, but it's so important. Let's just focus on this for a bit. I tell you what, if you can keep your answers down to a minute each, we'll get a bit more in. Okay? Phil, you know, you talked about the digital strategy of Manchester United, and then you picked out some of the elements about the tone that you're trying to set. And it's quite clear to me that your digital strategy is very much a creative business. You're really trying to drive the fun of being a Manchester United fan, aren't you? It's not really just about the business head that you've got on, but the creative head that you've got there.
It's true, and I think that word's used quite a bit in the office, actually, as if we're reviewing content or looking at content, it's not fun enough, or it needs to be more fun. And I think ultimately, that's to lead the way that this younger demographic is creating content. And I think ultimately every single piece of content that you publish or that you release should be under the premise of, is it compelling enough to push the send button? And ultimately, when people laugh at content, that ultimately makes them push the send button. So that's kind of a nice little trigger to ask yourself as you publish content, will this entice people to push the send button?
Bernard, in your research and the way you look at demographic trends and consumer trends, is there some kind of formula that racing can look at, that it can tap into to get this kind of access to the leisure and entertainment market?
Well, I have a very, very simple view of the world, that demographics is very simple. It's the wallpaper, it's the background, if you like. The trends are there, you only have to look for them. Putting together this issue of fun with emotional connection, I actually see those two being connected. You're actually trying to drive engagement, to push the send button. So I think fun, emotional connection and engagement are absolutely important. From a broader perspective, I do see an important shift globally that I would see impacting this industry and providing an opportunity going forward. I think the whole issue around gender balance is absolutely critical. And the point that Louis made around this is the only sport where you actually do have males and females and athletes actually competing against each other. I think that is a real sell point. I think the actual experience of the racetrack is also articulated and gender friendly. I think that can be played upon, leveraged up to the advantage. I think that is going to gather momentum. If you actually look at where Asia is at the moment, yes, it's about proving success, driving self-esteem. The next iteration there is around equality and fairness. And I think there's an opportunity for horse racing to be on the front foot and to actually set the agenda very early on. And the attributes of the sport actually lend itself to that.
Just to add to that I actually wrote that down as well about the male and female competition as a non-race fan to some extent. I've been there, but that's never connected to me in my brain in terms of that it is both genders racing together, and I think that is a very interesting sell point, particularly where we are in today's
Phil, you're
society.
exactly the kind of person that Winfried wants to bring to the racetrack. So what strategies should racing be employing to get Phil Lynch to bring his wife and his family to the racetrack?
I was thinking about bringing not only him to the racetrack, bringing him into the organization, but, but then I have a problem. But I think for me it comes back that we, in a way, in racing, a lot of times look product-centric. We think we produce the best races, we do this, which is important. But the link to the consumer, I think that we are not specific what are the segments are and what is the value proposition. So it's not only having a fantastic race, it is how you create an emotional connectivity. And we have in Hong Kong started this journey, but besides what we do on the racetrack, the 24-hour engagement, the positioning for the different segments, the message for the different segments, has to be much more articulated. And what Phil says, it is in the end about fact-based decision-making. So in racing, we have to change to a much more business, consumer-centric approach than a product approach. We have, for example, when we created the Happy Wednesday brand, I brought somebody in who comes from the music industry, who's not within the organization, because he would be too creative and he would be very difficult to manage within an organization. So you have to have a much more outside-in look than what we do in a way from inside out. And that's probably the fundamental issue. We have good value propositions, we have created success, but I personally think on a global basis, we have to really change the perception how we work on this. And I think it's difficult in racing authorities to do it. I think it's more in a way that those who produce the events, who in a way have the live events, that they have worked broader together to create this kind of brand and the emotional connectivity.
Is it a matter of giving creative license, giving permission to be creative? I thought, Phil, the point you made about the piano, having the world's best player who plays the piano and then thinking, well, getting him to play the piano in the middle of Old Trafford, that is creative inspiration. Yeah. That if you are a traditional thinker focused on product, you kind of don't think of that. Yeah. So it's actually giving permission to be creative. Understand about controlling creative people, but maybe that's where we need to go. And in the end, if that can create emotional connectivity, and as I understand it, that creates extraordinary emotional connectivity with your fan base, added value. Just a simple, creative inspiration like that. How can we harness that? What are the structures we can put in place to actually to harvest that kind of thinking?
Are you saying take risks?
I think you do need to take risks. I think you certainly do need to take risks.
Louis,
yes,
Phil, in a moment.
Following what Winfried said, I just want to mention that we were going to start Happy Thursdays in Longchamp. We have a part of the racecourse which has been specially planned for that, with a lot of area facilities. And at the same time, we will have music and a lot of entertainment. But we will also have always next to them some simulators of a race, so some way for the people to discover more and to learn more about our activity.
So, Phil, are you, in your job, just directing your content and your business strategy towards people who are already Manchester United fans, or do you try to think, how do I bring new fans in? Not even ones who don't necessarily like football. Like, for example, how would you get my wife to be interested in Manchester United? It's a big task.
Yeah, so the answer is both, right? So I think, going back to what Bernard was saying, I think one of the main keys is you take your existing fan base and you're trying to drive more engagement out of what that is, right? And I think if you talk to any of the social networks, it's not about the number of followers, it's about the number of interactions and the number of engagement. You get that, and then you can also even go further down the chain where somebody that's spending 8 to 10 minutes with your own website is a lot more engaged than somebody pushing a heart on Instagram or however that works, right? So there's different levels of engagement. To answer the question about your wife, one of the things that I think most organizations are challenged with is this concept of being institutionalized, and you're kind of taught, and you know what you know, and you learn what you do. So what I would probably suggest for a lot of content that's created, prior to pushing it to your fans or to your so-called fans, send it to your mother, send it to your aunt, send it to your uncle, and get that outsider's perspective over what they think about that content. Because if you send it to somebody else in the office or somebody else from a different association that's also in racing, they're institutionalized as well. So you kind of got to break out of those barriers to get honest feedback.
Okay, briefly, Bernard, if you don't mind, because one final question is coming.
Who thought of the piano idea? Was that your idea? Was it some lowly person, and then the senior management having the ability to actually recognize that as a good idea? Where did it come from?
I wish the answer was me, but it was not. It was somebody within the organization.
Yeah.
But then having the humility to say, you know, that was a great idea, and actually pulling it forward, that requires an openness of management.
And it happened to be from an employee that is relatively new to the organization as well.
Very good. Okay, so I'll give you a minute and a half, okay? We'll go a minute over. Winfried, just finally, you see, from what Phil is saying and from what Bernard is talking about engaging people with new apps and this kind of engagement, how much is racing looking at new media, and how much is it looking to promote attracting people to the event itself, to the race track?
I think, in a way, the focus of a lot of racing organizers is to look at both new media and bringing people to the event. But I think the fundamental issue is that a lot of times people looking at it from a very inside perspective. And that's why I think we have to break out of the traditional habit, and we have to work with people who are maybe a little bit more bold, more creative. And that, in a way, we try in our organization to really push, in a way, the outside-in look. But sometimes you have to even deliberately to say, I assign this to an outside person, because within an organization, it is very difficult to bring new creative ideas in, and you have to be sometimes a little bit bold. So there is a clear focus of racing to do so, but I think a lot of times it's very traditional and not understanding really the different segments, what they want and what their value proposition is.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen in the audience, time for a coffee break. When we come back, we'll have a session about reaching and expanding racing's fan base, so kind of building on what we've opened with here at ARC 2018. Thank you very much indeed.